Okay, I want to apologize for being a little rushed at the end there. That 15-minute time limit kind of caught me off guard, and I wanted to say a few more things, so you will need to continue your notes with the screencast. We were talking about the Treaty of Versailles, which did end World War I, just some of the provisions within the treaty. And they're listed on the screen, so I'm not going to repeat them, but let me just say the key here is that the Allies are coming off really harsh on Germany in particular, and that's going to be a key factor moving forward into the next Great War, the Greater War, World War II. But you know, the harshness of their treatment is going to kind of be a weakness of the treaty in and of itself. In terms of like the money that they're requiring Germany to pay in war damages, Germany cannot afford these payments. Thus, they're going to be sent into a economic, chaos, and downturn for sure. And that's going to also generate a lot of hostility within, the German people and the government, and kind of spoiler alert, but they might vow vengeance for that one day, right? So we're going to see them kind of come up later on. But, also the fact that the Soviet Union or Russia was excluded from the, peace talks, that's going to cause some bitterness with them moving forward. But the other thing is that this treaty is just really humiliating for Germany. One aspect of it was a war guilt clause in which Germany had to solely admit responsibility for starting World War I, which, if you kind of recall how the war broke out, Germany is not solely responsible for starting World War I. Certainly their alliance plays a part in the outbreak of war, but they did not start this war alone. And so the whole experience is very humiliating for Germany. The United States actually, besides Wilson himself, the rest of the government does not approve of the main points of the Treaty of Versailles, kind of seeing the brutality in it, as well as being a little skeptical of Wilson's idea of the League of Nations. The U.S. is not ever going to officially ratify or accept the Treaty of Versailles, and we will actually sign our own treaty and agreement ending our war with Germany separately. But as a whole, the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that does end World War I. Please add a quick bullet underneath that idea of the treaty, just called the home front. I want to talk about just a couple of other things happening in the United States during World War I. If you're familiar with the term home front, when you were in a war, the home front is what's happening to the civilians, to the non-military life during a war. And luckily for us in the United States, usually we're not involved in the front lines of war, because the wars that our country has mainly been involved in are fought abroad. But what was happening in the U.S., kind of because of the war and during the war. And one of the things that is going to be happening is a series of attacks on civil liberties. And the following that you see on your screen is a quote from President Wilson, and I'll read it real quick. Once lead this people into war, and they'll forget there ever was such a thing as tolerance. To fight, you must be brutal and ruthless, and the spirit of ruthless brutality will enter into the very fiber of our national life, infecting Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, the man in the street. Conformity would be the only virtue, and every man who refused to conform would have to pay the penalty. Wilson predicts time of war in the United States is becoming a time where everyone kind of, criticizes any outlying perspectives, and kind of become very nationalist. And his predictions very much going to become true, as we'll see in some unofficial and official ways. So in terms of official ways, what I'm saying is that the U.S. government, like he referenced Congress and, the courts and the policemen, the U.S. government is going to take action with a series of laws called the Espionage and Sedition Acts, in which a person was not allowed to say anything that was disloyal or profane or abusive about the U.S. government, specifically referencing the U.S.'s involvement in World War I. They weren't allowed to interfere with the war effort in any way, and that included, being outspoken in the sense of protesting the war. This is a clear violation of the First Amendment. That's kind of what makes our government, unique, and what it is to kind of have this, this American ideal of, the freedom of speech and the ability to openly oppose your country's leadership or actions. You can't break laws in terms of, acting violently about it, but you're allowed to speak about your disapproval. But in this case, people were getting penalized for anything that was deemed, to be disloyal to America, during the war. So, newspapers and magazines that were openly opposing the war effort, they lost their mailing privileges. They weren't allowed to send out copies of their papers and their magazines. The House of Representatives refused a seat to a certain congressman who was actually elected, because he was considered to have anti-war views and be, too socialist. I think several universities would fire professors that were deemed to openly oppose the war, and they didn't want them to spread that ideology onto students. So definitely people paid the price with these acts, and again, they're not really constitutional, but they were allowed to exist during this time. We're also going to see immigrants targeted. Nativism is kind of reborn all over again. If you're familiar with the definition of nativism, it's, overt favoritism towards native-born Americans, non-immigrants, non-immigrant families. So the main targets of, this kind of anti-immigrant wave are going to be Americans who, are from other nations, particularly those who are from nations that were enemies during World War I. So Austria-Hungary and Germany in particular. Germany is really heavily targeted in this wave of anti-immigrant hysteria. Many Germans who had very obvious German last names lost their jobs. It kind of got ridiculous. Orchestras were refusing to play the works of Mozart and Bach and Beethoven. Some towns that had German names changed their names. Schools stopped teaching the German language. Librarians would start removing, German authors' books and novels from the shelves. And we see also a series of names, changing. It's kind of almost funny, but German measles became known as the Liberty measles, and hamburgers, which are named after the German city of Hamburg. If you ever had a hamburger steak, you ever heard it referred to as Salisbury steak? They started calling hamburger steak Salisbury steak in the 19-teens to, not want to support the, German influence on a hamburger. Dachshunds and German shepherds became Liberty pups. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage. It was just kind of, let's, take the German, influence out of our country altogether. But there was also some, violence against Germans. Mob violence, a few public lynchings, just some really unfortunate stuff. But again, that's just kind of an unfortunate effect of this, nativist era during World War I. And just one last note really quick, we're also going to see the initial signs of the Red Scare, the first Red Scare. With the Russian Revolution taking place, Americans will fear communist ideals and the idea that communism could spread into the United States. Obviously, that's going to become much more prominent during the Cold War era, which is more of the second Red Scare, but the first Red Scare is very much starting now because of the timing of the Russian Revolution. And the end of World War I didn't really help because production declines when the war ends because you don't need to make as many war goods, so unemployment rose. And when you had higher unemployment, people started joining labor unions, and there were labor strikes, and people really started to fear that the next step was going to be that, radicals were going to rise up and try to overthrow, the government, just like the Bolsheviks did in Russia. But that's, obviously not going to happen, but people were very paranoid about that idea during this time. So those are just a few more things and ideas that were kind of taking place in the United States during World War I, and that's kind of going to be our conclusion of the war. So it's a very, quick coverage of the war itself, so please write down any questions you have, and we'll discuss a little bit more in class on Wednesday.